You know, this actually isn't really my kind of aesthetic. Let me fix that. There. Also, do not forget, have a good drink. Actually, I'm not going to smoke this pipe because I'm actually here to talk to you. As you might get from the kind of meme joke there, this is about far-right terrorism. Alright, so, political violence, not the way forward. I should immediately start by saying I disavow political violence. It doesn't work. It's only used by the dominant ideology to reinforce itself. You can see this because Antifa can riot in the streets and get away with crimes that any nationalist would be locked up for because they are reinforcing the dominant ideology. Our side doing political violence only serves to facilitate censorship from the elite, to marginalize our views, to distance ourselves from the mainstream of the people who we want to try and convince, because what we want is to convince the majority of the population that our views are in their interest and to their benefit, unlike leftist views who are very far away from the natural order of things, who are unnatural, who are created by an excess of wealth, and they're unworkable. So political violence from our side is counterproductive. However, it has been increasing recently. We've seen since Brenton Tarrant there have been about 4 people who have taken direct inspiration. Most of them have been failures, pretty pathetic, thankfully, as was this recent shooter in Halle. He killed 2 people, unfortunately, 2 innocent people who really had very little to do with what he was trying to aim to achieve. One white woman, one owner of a shop, or an employee. I'm not quite sure whether it was someone who was getting food at the shop or it was the owner of the shop, but 2 people were killed. Innocent people basically had nothing to do with any of this. And I think that these sort of things happen precisely because there is repression of nationalists in politics. These are acts of desperation because people don't see any other way towards results, so they act out in extreme ways. And part of that is caused by them not having any structures or parties or options within the discourse or the political process to try and get their views represented. Within the idea of democracy, not that I'm necessarily particularly in favor of universal democracy, but in the idea of democracy, the idea is open debate and representation of all views, and the most popular views simply win out through the strength of their arguments and so on. Now, politics in reality is, of course, power games and is representing interest groups, whether those are the working class, business class, environmental groups, any. Politics is a representation of interest groups fighting it out with each other, and what you want is to have as honest enough discussion to try and get as much of the interests sorted without grieving too much of any of the other ones, right? Now, we know, of course, that this is pretty much a lie, that the idea of a liberal open democracy with honest dialogue is not real, because the media represses any sort of views that it considers not done. Liberalism doesn't allow for contrary views because all ideologies are in the end totalitarian and want to enforce their worldview upon the entirety of society, and dissenters are punished. Whether they are marginalized, like the extreme far left, who are kept sort of, they are thrown a bone occasionally so they can pretend that they're relevant and in opposition, or the far right, which is completely pushed out of power and out of the discourse. They're not even allowed to present their arguments or be honest. You'll notice this if you are in right-wing circles, that the left avoids you like you're a leper. They're not willing to engage in an honest discussion with you. They're not willing to engage with your arguments. All they do is brand you and it's done and there's no discussion. And that results in people who have a lot of grievances with the modern system acting out in other ways, in the only ways they see as producing any form of result, because they can't join nationalist groups. If they do join nationalist groups, they risk losing their jobs, being doxxed, ruining their relations with their family, sometimes friends. It's just, if you want to prevent terrorist attacks from any group, you have to allow them to participate in the discussion first and foremost. I think if you, for example, allowed Salafists to participate more in the discourse, you would have less terrorism, because the radical imams would have an actual platform to discuss rather than have to instigate their followers towards more radical actions, so someone will pay attention to their grievances. And their views would be aired. Now, of course, the current mainstream would neither allow a Salafist nor a nationalist to air their views, because their views on quite a lot of things are very similar. At any rate, I think the point generally is, if you want to avoid these sorts of terrorist attacks, stop trying to censor and repress people, because it doesn't work. It just radicalizes people further. It pushes more and more people towards thinking that there is absolutely no other solution but then to just become martyrs, try and use violence to get their point across, anything like that. Of course, it doesn't quite work like that. It gets a huge backlash, and those of us who are trying to be reasonable and trying to be part of the discussion, our work is made even more difficult, really, because people will say, well, you're on the same side as that guy who shot up that synagogue or that mosque, and why should we listen to you? You're liable to shoot up a mosque next week yourself, which is, of course, ridiculous, because I myself have no inclination to commit any sort of political violence. I think especially in the Netherlands, where the political discourse is more open than, for example, in most of the Anglo-Saxon world, or in Germany, or Sweden for that matter, you can say a lot more here. I think we can get towards something of a compromise solution through the political process, mostly, because unfortunately our nationalist party always compromise, always cuck, and they never actually stick to their agenda and promote their own people, and try and get their agenda through, because they're weaklings. But some points might get through, and I think in the Netherlands we might be able to get towards something of a compromise solution, because there is a more honest political discourse, because we have more room in our system for nationalist parties and for groups to grow and be represented. You can, in the Netherlands, without too much risk, become a member of a nationalist organization or a nationalist party. And it's, I mean, if you have leftist friends, that'll ostracize you, but it won't completely put you out of society. That's really, I think, the thing. If you allow a more honest discourse, you'll avoid these sorts of terrorist attacks, because they are acts of desperation from people who see no other means towards furthering this political agenda. Now, that's why I was in that funny get-up in the beginning, and that's what I think the message is. Allow for nationalists to have a say. If you think that what we say is idiotic, we won't get much public support anyway, right? So, what's really the risk? That we get a few seats, you'll boycott us from the parliament anyway. At least, if you allow people to have a few seats and have a bit of a say, you'll avoid the terrorist attacks, I think. Cheers.